Hello guys, this is Dark Fox Sage 2 and we are back with our new fanfic, which is What If Naruto Found the Pain Hidden Behind Ino's Smile Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic, then please press the like button and please subscribe to the channel. It motivates me to upload more fanfic like these for you all. Now let's start the fanfiction. Ino had always wondered when she had been young and naive why people feared the dark. Because, really, there was nothing scary in the lack of light. Everything was still the same at night as it was during the day, you just had to squint a little more to see it just as well. She'd wondered why most her friends feared the dark because she knew that the monsters that they were told by their parents were lurking in the darkness could not, exist. But Ino had grown up and found that there were, in fact, very much real monsters brooding in the lightlessness. Monsters that could be the last thing that ever happened to you if you weren't quick enough, capable enough, strong enough. At 22, Ino still didn't know why others feared the dark. But she didn't dwell on it anymore either. All that mattered was that she was afraid of the darkness as well. And it was ironic, really, because she was a kunoichi, a very important part of the reconnaissance shinobi force too, and it was ridiculous of her to be afraid of her greatest ally. There was no reconnaissance without aid of stealth, and stealth was greatly aided by the darkness. It allowed you a bit more freedom of movement. It was even more ridiculous of a grown woman to shudder slightly when the lights went out because she was chakra sensitive and reasonable enough to know that there was nothing in her hollow apartment aside from her, and yet, when the light played with the tasteful curtains, she couldn't help but pull the comforter a little higher up her body, in a vain attempt to chase away the paranoia that the darkness begot in her. How could she not be afraid of the same thing that helped her so much if it hypocritically helped her enemy just the same? How could she not fear that which in skilled hands became a formidable weapon? How could she not be wary when she was well aware that there was always someone better than you, someone who is more at ease with the darkness, can use it better, can use it against you without strain? And how was she to feel safe when even the darkness behind her eyes was no longer comforting, her nightly visions haunted by crimson irises with hypnotizing windmills swirling in them? How could she not fear the dark that housed the twin demon orbs of the defector, that accommodated them so well against her? She hated the dark, because the dark made her weak. The dark made her disoriented and scared. The darkness obscured her goals and dreams and became only a vortex of blackened emotions that she didn't want to feel, emotions that seared her whole being when they reached into her. She detested the dark because it was so vast, so ever-encompassing that it seemed like it could swallow her whole and not leave a memory of her existence behind, as if she had never been there in the first place. And she loathed that thought, with every fiber of her being, for she had not grown up to be someone so impressive in character, with such great impact on those around her, to be so easily discarded. Yet she was a kunoichi. It was part of a kunoichi's life to live in the dark, deal with it and learn to use it well. It was either kill or be killed in the cruel game that was her life. You either adapt or perish. Idiotic things as being skittish of a little lack light were not tolerated in the harsh reality. There was no room for fear when you have chosen the path of a tool for your village to use as it saw fit. She eradicated her fear of the dark every night, and every morning it came back full force, as if she'd never given it any effort at all. It was a vexing vicious circle that she couldn't seem to break out of. So she lived on, in the darkness which she abhorred because she dreaded, away from prying eyes, inconspicuous to all her colleagues. She lived on, alone and cowering in the darkness, unwilling to ask anyone's help anymore, because, really, who would help her when she couldn't even help herself? Because there was no way logical, down-to-earth Yamanaka Ino was truly afraid of a little darkness, right? And she assured herself she was content with maintaining that notion. As she lurked in the sparse light of the dingy pub, she mused that the darkness had its benefits and good points as well. When it was so dark, no one could see her fears, her remorse, her shame or her failures. Her flaws were expertly hidden away in the lack of lighting, not to be looked upon by prying eyes. No one needed to know that she was just as human, just as imperfect, just as capable of mistakes, as everyone else was, as long as she had the darkness to shroud her faults. For when the bar was so slightly illuminated, no one could see just how deadened her eyes were, just how deep her rue ran. And it was better that way, because she didn't really need anyone's help at all. She had her accursed darkness, that double-faced bastard that a shinobi could not live without and yet couldn't live within. Frightening. This paradox, wasn't it? It was almost enough to make you laugh out loud. Almost. She stirred languidly the contents, or rather the lack of such, of her shot glass, eyeing the melting ice with unseeing cornflower blue orbs. Her vision had long since blurred irreversibly, it seemed, but the fog stifling her mind was still not thick enough to suit her fancy. It didn't not wrap well around the thoughts that she didn't want to access, at least until morning. It did not give her the absolution that she so desired yet. The blonde felt and heard a large body, male, she deduced at once, slump on the stool next to hers, but as long as the person did not bother her, she could see no reason to bother him either. She lifted the empty glass to the bartender. "Hey, uncle, be a nice guy and give another one of these, would you?" She shook the glass suggestively before placing it on the counter, waiting for her refill. She was positively drunk, but not drunk enough not to feel someone's gaze on her. She didn't pay that any heed either, though. She was used to being ogled at in such vulgar places like pubs where all the abominations of society seemed to gather at all times. The bartender gave her a critical look which she returned effortlessly. He sighed and shook his head dejectedly while giving in, refilling her glass, and she could have sworn she heard him mutter something about deteriorating youth nowadays, and drowning misery in alcohol, inebriating themselves, but she couldn't have cared less. Not when her salvation was this close to her. She was brining the glass to her pinkish lips when a painfully familiar voice, though not in its regular, endlessly annoying pitch, which was a first to her, interrupted the ware's journey to her mouth. "Is it really a good idea to get yourself wasted in a bar full of men without any inhibitions who are equally as wasted?" Her hand hovered before her face as if frozen in place. She sighed in exasperation and guzzled down the alcohol in the glass in a breath. She ordered another one from the grumbling bartender, knowing that when dealing with this particular individual one needed to be properly inadequate not to try and strangle the life out of him. She dreaded even the moment she'd have to look at him, what was left for anything else. Slowly, the young woman turned a bored and flushed from all her drinking face to the newly arrived man, scrutinizing his listless cerulean eyes that seemed to shine through the barely existent light in the pub to bury right into her. "Honestly, Uzumaki," she began with a blatantly agitated tone, "don't you have someone else to pester with your profound advice in life? I seriously don't feel like I want to hear any more of it." Naruto watched with what seemed complete disinterest how she received another shot of whatever she was on, which she in turn immediately downed. He'd been watching her repeating the same thing over and over again from a distant corner of the pub for some time before finally deciding on coming over and seeing what was the cause of her drinking frenzy. She was usually quite averse to alcohol, going as far as to say it tasted awful on several occasions in the past. He was frankly curious. Did something happen? Ino knew her hand would start shaking as if in a seizure if she reached for the glass then. So instead she balled her hands tightly into fists and threw Naruto a death glare that was lost on his dense nature. The concern that his cerulean eyes radiated was a bit too much for her to swallow. "Even if something did happen, you're the last person I'd go to." Angry at the guy's impertinence, that dumb blonde busybody, Ino swung her miraculously refilled glass again and gulped down another portion of the throat-searing liquid. The world was out to get her if it sent her Naruto, of all people, when she least wanted to see any familiar face. Go rain your sympathy on someone else, preferably a person who actually needs it. She stirred the remaining crystalline drop of melted ice in front of her hardened azure eyes. "Because I, for one, do not." Naruto had always been knuckleheaded, never knowing when to stop. But his annoying factor was obviously at its peak that night because he didn't get the message and, Instead of turning tail like every part of her body was screaming at him to do, he leant on the counter on his elbow, propping his chin up on the heel of his hand. Yeah, he intoned conversationally in a noncommittal voice. Could have fooled me. This time the glass did make a cracking sound under the pressure of her tight grip. Ino was leaning on every ounce of sanity she still had left not to slug the idiot in the ugly mug for that comment just now. How dare he just waltz over to her and start asking her questions as if he had any right to know the answers? How dare he look at her with that absolutely pathetic face? Wasn't he just a ray of fucking sunshine? He rent the darkness enveloping her as if it was his place to do so. What an irksome guy. She felt an urge and, before she could think better of it, she gave into it. What would you know how it feels to lose your parents, dead last? It's not as if you ever had any to begin with, she hissed out venomously, her words carefully picked so they could cut deeper than the sharpest blade. She hadn't called him that in 10 years, dead last. 10 years in which she'd grown to know him better, to admire him and respect him. Yet in her ire she knew well what to say, to call him the one way his once brother had demoted him without even giving him the time of the day, just to make him feel if even just a fraction of the pain that she was experiencing. But the bastard took even that tiny victory away from her as the only sign that she'd hit a nerve was a shadow crossing his eyes before it was gone with the next blink of his lids. The asshole, was he actually invincible? He looked sympathetically at her. My condolences, he offered in a voice barely above a whisper. And it pissed her off, that he seemed so sincere trying to recollect something about her parents even though he didn't even know them, hadn't even cared any about them while they were still alive. It annoyed her as hell, but all the indication she gave was the tight narrowing of her eyebrows and a barely discernible eye twitch that was gone almost the moment it surfaced. It wasn't his fault he was so stupid. It wasn't his fault he irritated her so without even trying. It wasn't his fault they were dead. Well, that, and she felt a bit guilty for purposefully trying to dig into an obviously gaping wound. So instead of biting his head off, which was her initial choice of reaction, she opted for calling to the bartender instead. Hey, uncle, won't you give my friend here some of that good stuff as well? He seems keen on getting some. The man behind the counter eyed Naruto expectantly, who in turn only shrugged his shoulders lightly in consent. The elder male shook his head and sighed, doing as his drunken lady customer desired, not very eager to see what would happen if he didn't. She appeared to be one of those troublemaking ones if she didn't have her way while under the steady hold of inebriation. By the kunai pouch he'd seen on her slender thigh on her way over to the stool when she'd entered, she was a shinobi too, all the more reason not to push his luck. After so many years of tending to a bar, you learned a thing or two about the kinds of people that frequented them. When his drink arrived, instead of following Ino's lead and downing it as soon as it was in her sight, Naruto just eyed critically the small glass with the crystalline clear liquid. Losing interest in it soon, he turned his studious gaze towards his companion on the counter, who in turn only glared at him. Her attempt at intimidating him fell flat on its face considering how blurred her vision already was though. Don't be a prude, Naruto. Drink up, drink up. When he didn't relent, she took her own full glass and raised it to him, for the Yamanakas. And drank at her toast. Naruto sighed lightly through his nose. She was being cynical. He wasn't sure what to make of it. This wasn't exactly what he had planned on when he'd made his way over. Hell, he hadn't even wanted to play the part of the knight in shining armor for her, and neither did he want all the drama, but his sense of propriety had prohibited him from leaving without doing something for his vaguely friend-like person when she seemed perturbingly bent on getting herself stoned so bad she wouldn't remember her name in the morning. It was just wrong to leave a girl behind when she seemed to lose herself completely to the glass, you know. That is why Naruto did the gentlemanly thing and downed his glass in a gulp under the slightly surprised and even just a tiny bit amused glance of his recently promoted drinking buddy. And they said that you were absolutely hopeless at everything back in the day. He didn't appreciate her joke or sarcasm, and his sardonically cocked brow should have told her that, but it mattered little when she planned not to remember the night at all tomorrow. You're quite a natural when it comes to drinking, Naruto-kun. She was adding the suffix just to spite him, and it annoyed him that he could actually feel it. The least she could have done was try and be subtle about her resentment. And, while his overall attitude hadn't suffered much change, over the years the blonde Hokage wannabe had learned how to retaliate to being poked fun at and sneered upon by his peers. Here, have another, she interjected. Ino raised her own glass in another toast, but this time he didn't dignify her attempt at mocking him. She shrugged her dainty shoulders, which were very much too exposed for a bar of such nature at that particular hours of the day, and mimicked his actions from a minute ago, the scalding hot liquid burning her esophagus right down to the pit of her stomach. She grimaced at the feeling and let out a hiss. Gotta love the feeling of approaching absolution. Don't you? Her obviously forced attempts at small talk did nothing to soothe his rising ire. Haven't you had a bit too much to drink tonight, Ino-chan? He asked tentatively, putting a hand over her glass when she made a move to bring it to her lips again. Neither noticed how much larger his hand was than hers. Not that it was something overly important to note in the first place too. Ino's slightly dazed cornflower blue eyes bore into Naruto's remotely concerned cerulean eyes, not really looking for anything there. She made a show of thinking his query over, scrunching her face up slightly and rolling her eyes to the ceiling. It was all a good guy could do not to sigh in aggravation at her behavior. His students in his Genin 3-man cell were more mature than her at that moment. And they were just 5 years old. I can still feel perfectly well every inch of my body, which would go to say that nothing has really gone to my head at current, so, no, I think I am going to stay here a while. She pulled her wrist free of his hold and gave him the fakest and most saccharine smile he had ever seen in his life. And that was saying something, because he was one of the people who had had to force those on their faces one too many times. Your concern is quite uncalled for and very much not appreciated, so if that was all you wanted to talk to me about, do feel free to excuse yourself and scurry off, doing whatever it is you do when you're not pushing your nose into others' business. He had been about to leave, really. There was absolutely no one on the face of the earth that would stand that much insult and wouldn't want to leave. But seeing how much she wanted that to happen just tickled his fancy a bit, just enough to make him compromise with his sanity and stay just to annoy the daylights out of her the way she had tried to do with him. He wasn't vindictive. Oh, by any means, no. But she had it coming, and she would get what was coming for her, because a future Hokage's main worry is the well-being of his villagers, even if they were bitchy drunken kunoichi. Little he knew that Ino was much more annoyed than she let on. He was spoiling her fun after all. He waltzed over unannounced, shoving his unwanted help in her face and expecting her to just surrender her glass like that and just go peacefully home. Whoever would give in to that kind of persuasion? She hated it when others intruded on her private time. There were few instances when she actually sought out the despised darkness, but when she did, she usually had a good goddamn reason for it. How was she supposed to submerge her mind in the dark absolution if he kept pestering her with his questions and pretense kindness and worry? She hadn't asked him to come to her and try to save her from the dark. She'd been perfectly well on her own, drowning in the sea of forgetfulness that bore no light. And then he interjected, dragging her back to the shore of utter consciousness, because she still had a long way to go with the number of drinks to become a hopeless cause for saving. She hadn't wanted him to come over and bring his accursed natural radiance with him. She didn't want any of it. He was from the type of people that she abhorred in her guts. Even when he was broody, angsty and a quiet drunk, he was just too goddamn bright, you know. Ino's perceptive ears heard him slide off the chair sluggishly and trot away from her in a steady pace. She heaved a sigh of relief and rolled her eyes upwards, as if to thank any higher instance that had taken mercy on her. Good riddance, she muttered under her breath and relaxed back into her stool, closing her eyes to enjoy the sensation of her mind growing progressively numb. Sheer bliss, that it was. And she could finally enjoy it on her own, too. Now that was truly priceless, after she'd got to know how it felt when she wasn't on her own. She'd thought that she'd be able to enjoy her alone brooding time a little while longer, too, when she heard a bottle, which was still full, judging by the sound it made when connecting with the surface of the counter, land by the side of her hand. She looked out of the corner of her eye to see who was bothering her this time. There was just no end to the busybodies tonight, only to groan in despaired annoyance, her head lolling back on her neck dejectedly. She made for a really pathetic sight, she was sure, but at that particular moment in time she couldn't have cared less. You see, she was just so busy cursing every divinity there was for even entertaining the thought of letting a creature such as Uzumaki freaking Naruto survive to his 22nd anniversary of being born with no realistic prospects of his life ending in the near future, to care about much else. Now, Ino-chan, I know we got off on the wrong foot. The blonde abomination sat back in his seat, one hand still clutching the bottle of alcohol. But I have an idea that I'm sure that you're going to love. Ino cocked an unimpressed finely shaped brow at the thought that Naruto, of all people, could even know the first thing about her to be able to talk like that, but she decided to let it slide just this once in favor of his much more curious insinuation. Do you, really? Since we're both going to stay here a while, I thought I could challenge you to see which one of us endures alcohol better, just to see who's the better sport between the two of us. He laughed lightheartedly, his face alight with mirth. The blonde girl's brows furrowed with aggravation again. Too damn bright. You're willing to compete with me, she said slowly, as if it was inconceivable even to think that kind of thing. Of course, she completely omitted to comment that he was talking to her as if she was one of his goofy goons with which he could have belching contests and whose thing below the belt is ugliest, juxtapositions. She was a lady, and it went without saying that such language was not suited before one. Naturally, there were times when a lady forgot she was a lady. Like when she'd deny it hotly if said to her face, larger than ordinary ego was being, unjustly so, doubted. He shrugged noncommittally, as if what he'd just off-handedly thrown into the conversation did not come on par with obscene blasphemy in the middle of a sermon in front of a premise full with fanatically religious patriarchal men with serious anger management problems. Well, I figured you wouldn't wanna, since you've probably been drinking a while and it would be just unfair to start now. You're on. She slammed her forearm on the counter as she said that, interrupting forcefully his tirade that obviously meant to disregard her. If there was one thing she really hated, it was to be looked down upon, for whatever reason. She wasn't about to let this mistake of nature treat her like a second-rate human being just because she was mourning. But I'm going to warn you now that I'm really good at this despite my appearance, so you better ready yourself to grovel at my feet when I beat your ass, ha. Naruto smirked semi-conceitedly, crossing his arms over his well-built chest. Is that so? Well, we'll just have to see, right? He lifted his glass in a silent toast that Ino indulged with one of her own grudgingly. Cheers. The drinking game was on. And Ino didn't plan on losing it. But things don't always necessarily go as we plan them to, do they? Ino found that to be just the case with her drinking win. Naruto had to admit that she did fare quite well though. She'd drunk so much before he joined her and she'd drunk even more after he did. To her credit, even when it was becoming increasingly obvious by how flustered her expression was becoming that she was getting more and more inebriated, she never quite let her mind sway under the effects of the alcohol. If anything, some of her more infuriating qualities amplified painfully bitchiness, loudness, snarky comments, frequency, and so on and so forth, but she was still 100% Ino. He was sincerely surprised and not entirely unpleasantly so. Sure, it had taken him a bit more time and money to get her wasted enough to be able to drag her out of the pub. Semi-unconscious too, mind you, because he'd figured in the first few minutes of their so-called game, that it was the only way to get her out of that place in her current state of mind, but it was worth the useful knowledge. He could use a drinking buddy the next time because everyone else he could opt for wasn't nearly as endurable as she was. As they trudged on slowly, one of her slender arms slung over his much broader shoulders, Eno all but hanging lifelessly from said appendage in his firm hold, there was something that the blonde vessel couldn't keep to himself for some reason. Perhaps he felt that he had to do her justice for her earlier performance. He didn't know. He had just always lacked this infinitely beneficial quality that most living creatures possessed by default, self-preservation instinct they called it. Fancy name for something so simple, isn't it? He was sometimes so simple-minded that you can't help but wonder why, oh why he still hasn't acquired it, after getting smacked around so much by his pink-haired teammate. I have something to confess, Eno-chan, because it's just too unfair to leave you in the dark about it. She gave an undignified grunt as her heavy-lidded swimming eyes continued boring into the ground she dragged her feet against. She hated that phrase, leaving someone in the dark. It was such an insensitive phrase, especially when used with someone who hated the darkness as much as she did. She wasn't about to tell Naruto that though. There was as much beating as a proud girl's pride could take for one single night. As if it wasn't enough that she could barely stand on her own and he didn't even have a difficulty with walking in a straight line, she wouldn't grant him the pleasure of knowing her greatest secret, darkest one too, and she could have laughed out loud at that thought for the irony of it, if she wasn't sure that it was something only hopelessly drunk people did, laugh for no apparent reason, and she was not hopelessly drunk, just a bit tipsy, that's all. I, kinda never get drunk, no matter how much I have to drink. Her fine brow twitched at that little piece of information. I guess Kyuubi makes quick work of the toxins or something, but it never gets to my head, no matter what I do. So, I knew beforehand what the outcome would be, which is why I suggested it. He grinned guiltily at her profile next to him and her eyes narrowed even more. Sorry about leading you on like that. She hadn't just been humiliated. She had been humiliated on purpose. Now that made things quite different. She was sure that there had to be something worse that could happen to you. She just couldn't think of anything at the moment. Suddenly she wanted to have as little physical contact with this foul creature that had made her seem so ridiculous as possible, given the predicament she found herself in, what with being unable to focus on anything at all if she didn't particularly strive for it. She snatched her arm back from him rather abruptly, and the action almost had her lose her balance. With all the mercy of the heavens above and the grace she possessed naturally, she managed to stay upright and take a few wobbly steps on her uncertain feet on her own. Brilliant, she muttered to herself after a few meters of dragging herself onward with Naruto hot on her tail like a homeless puppy. She hadn't felt pathetic while getting drunk, but she definitely did at current. This was definitely not the way she'd hoped to spend the night mourning her parents' death. This irksome sobriety of mind, born from the presence of another while trying to get inebriated, was just as much as she could take before she started feeling the urge to rip things to shreds to vent some of her frustration. And the fact that she had a provoking factor in the face of one endlessly bothersome Uzumaki Naruto definitely did not help soothe her temper. Which only led her to conclude, more firmly this time, and with a point-making roll of her slightly mismatched eyes. Just freaking brilliant. It helped even less that he walked beside her as if she was fragile or would topple over herself any minute now, which she nearly did several times, but that is just besides the point now, isn't it? I know you're probably angry, and you perhaps have every reason to, but I'm sure it'd be a lot better if you just. He began to coax her but was halted mid-sentence by the extended forefinger shoved in his face. He blinked several times, as if attempting to blink the shock away. Damn right I have every reason to, Uzumaki, and, no, I am perfectly fine walking on my own. I've been able to for 20-something years now, and I hadn't needed your help once during that time. I don't plan on starting now. She nodded curtly to herself after her little independent statement and turned on her heel to get back to marching towards her flat. Or as close to marching as she could get without letting either of her feet really leave the ground. He seemed just as determined not to respect her strive for independence though. How could she tell? It was quite simple, when he kept following and pestering her even after she'd said that to his face. Didn't that guy know when to quit? Well, I got you in this predicament, but he was once again cut short by her brisk words before he could get an entire sentence out. That should have been hint number one for him to take a hike. Men. And I am going to get myself out of it. And there will be no cause for you to worry, because the moment I can't see your ugly mug will be the one that all my troubles go away. There was just so much bite to her words that his feet temporarily ceased to work. This led him to staying, nailed to the spot, in the midst of the deserted dusty street of Konoha, staring at the hunched back of the retreating female. In that moment, he couldn't help but wonder, why was he still pushing himself? As far as chivalry was concerned, he'd done the gentlemanly thing by getting her out of that bar even though he'd been forced, he reasoned to himself, to resort to not very chivalrous ways of accomplishing that, and, since she was knuckle-headed enough to demand getting home by herself, who was he to stop her? He really would be better off leaving right then and doing both of them a favor. But, he hung his head against his collarbone in dejection, heaving a great sigh from the exhaustion that was yet to come. When his head rose again, it was with new determination that he faced her depressingly slouched figure, lugging itself down the narrow street. Sometimes he thought he was masochistic, but being the good guy really sucked. Big time. He caught up to her and fell into her step. It wasn't that difficult since she could barely breathe, not to mention move efficiently, facing forward stubbornly as well. She rolled her eyes from his insistence but chose to do the smarter thing and just kept her mouth shut, doing her best not to need the help of the hand that stretched out before her, with the full intention of breaking her fall should it come to that, every time she lurched forward a bit too convincingly. After many ordeals, not really, but walking itself had become such a challenge these days, they finally arrived at her block. Before opening the door of the main entrance, she shot him a questioning look that he returned coolly, standing right behind her. She huffed ill-temperedly. What? You're going to let yourself in here, too? Have you nothing better to do with your free time than stalk me around? Whatever you say, Ino, just get up those stairs to your flat, if you'd please. He then made a movement as if to usher her inside. Her jaw hung open and her barely focused eyes blazed suddenly with anger before it wore off, as quickly as it appeared. She glared at him some more, her lips a taut, thin line before she began to ascend the stairs, one at a time to assure she wouldn't fall on him. Was he purposefully lagging behind her, to make sure she'd fall on him, should it come to that, and not risk breaking her skull open? Because that kind of thing would just annul the point she was trying to make on the entire way here. Just to make sure we're clear on this, I go along with what you say because it's what I intended to do in the first place, she informed him over her shoulder while fiddling with her apartment keys. She missed the keyhole. And again. And again. He cringed. Not because you told me to. Got that? And again. Let me. He emphasized, prying the keys from her hands before she could object. He swiftly unlocked the door and swung it open, stepping aside for her to enter, an expectant look on his face. Hers was fixed into one of utter disdain that he discredited completely. Shaking her head in disbelief, the girl made her way inside, not bothering to flick the lights on as she did so. He tried to step over the threshold after her as well but was stopped by the open palm shoved in front of his nose. And that's how far you go. It's been touching. Not at all though, this overbearing concern of yours for me that suddenly materialized out of the blue. Not that I mind, but, seriously, never give me a taste of it again, but from here on I can really handle it myself. She crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at him. The effect wasn't as great when it was obvious she could barely focus on him though. So you're free to crawl back to whatever hole you crawled out of in the first place. It's been really pleasant, and she said the word with the same tone she would have cursed someone to their grave, chatting with you tonight. Ta-ta. To add some drama, she slammed the door in his face. Once she could no longer see him, She nodded to herself, a pleased, and very much deranged for an onlooker, grin slid on her face. Content with a job well done, she made a turn to go to her room only to stop dead in her tracks when she was encountered once again by Naruto's skeptic frown. She seriously started to ponder if she needed some professional help because she was dead certain she'd seen him on the other side of that door when she closed it. As if reading her thoughts, which was a dreadful idea in itself, the blonde abomination told her in an offhand tone. You do know that I am a shinobi specializing in the shadow clone technique, right? It was all the explanation she needed to hear. Not that she needed the reminder how wasted she must be to forget something like that. The guy only performed the technique several hundred times in every fight and sometimes even for daily chores if he needed an extra hand. Ino groaned with all the despair that she felt building up inside her. Don't you have someone else's night you could ruin? This is getting very tiresome, and I meant it when I said not seeing your face would make everything just so much better. She slumped on the sofa in her pragmatically compact in size living room and buried her head in her hands. She could already feel a headache coming on, and she'd always thought hangover didn't catch up with you until sunrise the day following the drowning of your consciousness. Naruto snorted. Really, Ino, you shouldn't show so much gratitude for me taking the time of my day to make sure you don't make a complete fool out of yourself in public when actually I should have just sat back and enjoyed the spectacle. You're going to make me blush with your extreme flattery. He went over to her and sat on a chair opposite her. The blonde girl exhaled a calming breath before pulling her hands away from her face. She was so exhausted, and all she really wanted was to be left alone. How was she supposed to let herself break down for her loss properly when there was someone in the room to witness it? She was Yamanaka Ino, parentless Yamanaka Ino, as of today, or rather yesterday, since it was a bit past midnight, and she did not cry her eyes dry in front of others. Especially not annoying chatterboxes like her pal, Naruto here. You want me to show gratitude? Alright, Naruto, gratitude it is you'll get. He steeled himself for another snarky tirade. He could feel it coming. Thank you so much sparing me the embarrassment of being ogled for an entire night by a mob of lifeless drunkards and waking up next to someone whose name I won't remember in the morning. Thank you for taking me back from a hellhole of a pub back to my cozy little apartment where everything reminds me of the fact that my parents are no longer among the living and that it happened so suddenly I had no chance to say goodbye to them before they passed on. Naruto blinked a few times, trying to digest what Ino was saying instead of focusing on how broken her eyes looked at that moment, glazed over from the countless shots she'd taken, and the emotion just welled up in her whenever she talked about this. But it was too late to stop her now. She was on a row and it was his entire fault, so he'd have to listen raptly, if just out of good manners. Thank you a million times over for taking care that I stay sober enough to want to hurt everyone and everything I lay eyes upon just because I'm bitter at the world in general instead of harmlessly slurp my booze on a counter. And, on a related note, I am most deeply sorry for going all PMS on you, but you see, the only two people who ever really loved me for who I am and supported me no matter how badly I screw up everything just up and died, and all I could do was just brave the news without given the chance to get stark raving drunk because this hypocrite of an acquaintance of mine thought he could ride in on his white horse and save me. The damsel in distress, and prove to the world what a good guy he was by refusing me the comfort of oblivion just because it's wrong for a lone girl to get stoned in a bar full of low-lives. She got up from the sofa after she dropped the rock on him, her resent glaringly obvious in her cornflower blue eyes as she scrutinized him. I just can't thank you enough for all the wonderful things you did for me in this time of need. As a token of my appreciation, make yourself at home while I go freshen up, huh? We can have chocolate chip cookies and talk about academy old stories and get to know each other better now that we're all buddy-buddy like, you know. And with that she disappeared behind a door that he presumed was her bathroom. This left him to reevaluate what she'd just said and try to come up with an excuse for still sticking around at this point in time. He hadn't really needed to come see her get in her apartment, not really. And perhaps his concern for her had been a bit selfish and inconsiderate of what her wishes might be. Instead of getting her pissed drunk and taking her back to her apartment, he could have just sat quietly in his corner, sipping his drink and making sure no suspicious folks approached her until she passed out, when he could have carried her home without a hitch in plans. Both their evenings would have been fine, or at least so they'd lie to themselves, because there is a reason people seek out the glass, and everyone would be safe and happy. The fact he was in the wrong about her wishes on the subject did not change that she'd been a royal bitch to him all the while, letting him know how much she resented his presence, and behaved freakishly rude, even for Yamanaka Ino. Naruto sighed deeply. There was no longer any need for his help. There probably never was, but there was just no way in hell he would have just left her there to drown her brains where anyone could take advantage of her fragile state of mind, kunoichi or not. It just went against his moral code, though they weren't exactly friends, and his staying was thus required no more. He'd been ridiculed, teased and insulted a few too many times that night, and he'd been just as mean to her on many levels, so that called for a time out. Ino was in her apartment, would be soon in her bed, with no pressing threats to her well-being. His mission as a gentleman was complete. And it was a gentleman's duty to know when the appropriate time to leave was, and, judging from the results of his chivalrous attempt to help, he'd need to work on that part of being a gentleman. He pushed himself to his feet and went to Ino's closed bathroom door, knocking softly on it. "I'll take my leave after I seem to have caused so much damage for one night, Ino-chan, and once again, you have my condolences and my sincerest apology." He sighed again, his shoulders slumping with the sigh. "I meant well, you should know that." He stood, silent, awaiting any response from her, before venturing on, "Well, by then, and take good care of your head, because you'll have the mother of all hangovers tomorrow." When there was still no reply, no sound of movement whatsoever too, from the opposite side of the door, he took the hint and took his leave. It was odd, though, that Ino wouldn't gloat or at least throw a last insult at him before his departure. He'd already been nosy enough, and if everything was all right in there, she'd have his head for it. Before he knew what had happened, he was already pushing down the handle of the bathroom door. He winced at the sight that greeted his sore eyes. He knew that it was out of character, this silent treatment that she was giving him, and he had only known the girl for one night. There, on the tastefully picked tiles, lay sprawled the body of Yamanaka Ino, who was very much unconscious. Massaging his brow, the young shinobi kneeled down to gather her limp body in his arms and get her in a more comfortable position that could assure some quality rest. As he carried her through her eerily dark and quiet apartment, he noted how light she was, even though that was completely irrelevant to everything. She could vaguely remember it was pitch black behind her eyelids before she opened them, and it was still pitch black in her apartment when she awoke. The best part was she didn't remember falling asleep or closing her eyes in the first place. And she especially didn't remember crawling into her bed beneath the covers. The last things she could recall, blurrily at best too, was throwing up all the booze that she'd drunk and rinsing her teeth before putting the brush down and looking at her reflection in the mirror. And afterwards everything went black, which she could guess was her clue that she'd fainted, for whatever reason. This fabricated explanation of the events following her biting down on Naruto's head a bit too severely than was absolutely necessary was plausible but certainly lacking. It did nothing to clarify why, for goodness sake, she wasn't bleeding her brains out from knocking her head on the tiles from her fall, or how she brought herself to her bed after fainting. Because she knew for a fact she was no sleepwalker, especially after a night out at a bar. On a not completely related topic, being afraid of the dark, which was currently surrounding her as the lights were off and it was well around the wee hours of the morning, had a great upside to it. You see, when you're wary and strained, all your senses amplify greatly, and when you're a kunoichi, that means you can see even the faintest of movements, hear the tiniest of sounds, and feel even the slightest shift in the air in the room. And thanks exactly to that monstrously amplified hearing, Ino was able to catch perfectly the sound of someone stirring awake with a barely audible grunt by her bedside. When their sleepy gazes met, even through the total lack of light, all of her questions were answered immediately because there was no mistaking that silhouette. "You're still here," she remarked coldly, her voice raspy from the mistreatment of her throat. "I didn't plan on being." Naruto appeared and sounded disoriented. He turned to massaging his temples for some tension relief. "I'm sorry, I must have nodded off while just taking a breather." He got up very quickly for someone who'd just awoken from a very uncomfortable sleep in an armrest-less chair. "I'm leaving right away." She was drunk, not stupid. Her mind was dimmed by the encroaching splitting headache, but she could still do the very simple math. "I put an aspirin for you on the nightstand and got you some water, you know, for tomorrow." "Thank you, Naruto," she interjected, smiling at him and hoping he'd see. He looked a bit uncertain for a second and she almost laughed, humorlessly, at that before clarifying, "I'm really grateful for everything." He made a face. "Before, or after you passed out on your bathroom tiled floor?" Now it was her turn to make a face, but she passed on it. "For everything, before and after." She made a pause, wondering how to phrase what she wanted to say. For once that night, she'd insulted, both intentionally and not, this guy enough for one day. And, if she had to be honest with herself, he didn't quite deserve all of it, just most of the hell she gave him. "I'm sure you meant well, even if, at any rate, thanks for being there." Yamanaka Ino was a girl of many, many talents. If there was something she couldn't do naturally well at, she honed her skill at it until she was practically the best at it. But there were two things she really sucked at that she would do nothing about: apologizing and thanking. Expressing her real feelings had never really been easy for Ino. When the time came to do one of the two aforementioned, she became stiff and her words just couldn't come out of her mouth the way she wanted them to, and it always became awkward afterwards. Like it was at that same moment. She could practically slice the silence with a knife, it was that tangible. "You're welcome, Ino-chan," he finally said, his voice only slightly strained. "That's what friends are for, after all." The blonde girl swallowed dryly, reverting her eyes to her tangled sheets in hopes of keeping the tears from spilling down her cheeks. She had the cover of the darkness, sure, but Naruto wasn't as dim as he made everyone else believe. She'd got to know at least that much tonight, and he was a good shinobi despite all her bitterness in that department about him as well, and he'd hear her sniffs and suppressed sobs if she broke apart now, no matter how much she'd try to suppress the sound. "Well," he began, making her head whip in his direction at her rapt attention, "I guess I better get going now, what with being really late with that unforeseen nap and all." He laughed in good humor, but she wasn't in the laughing mood, really. A sudden panic seized her that she couldn't even explain to herself, but she knew that she couldn't let him go home then. If she fell in the darkness one more time, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stand up again, not without her parents, not without her mentor, not with most of her friends off on missions all over the continent. So she did the one thing that would certainly prolong his stay, if even because he'd be too shocked to do much. It was also the one most idiotic thing she could have come up at such a time in the circumstances that she was in. She kissed Uzumaki bleeding Naruto fully on the lips. And she was right, he was too shocked to think about leaving. He was too shocked to even move. For about a couple of seconds, he sprung out of his chair, as though scalded by the contact. He was looking incredulously at her. What the hell was that? All that he was left to do was start spitting indignantly as if something foul had made it to his mouth, because he'd already added insult to injury by turning away so quickly from her. Not that she liked him like that, but she was Yamanaka Ino, for Christ's sake. She was the to-die-for girl of the former Rookie 9. It was a kiss, she snapped back in indignation. She was not a person who handled rejection well. What did it feel like? He was really still in shock though, because he made a sound, an odd mixture between a snort and a wheeze that was definitely not coherent. I know what it was. Why did you do it? His shrill tone was drilling on her nerves. Her temper was sure to flare soon. I can kiss whomever I want, whenever I want to, she declared confidently, crossing her arms over her chest. 2 hours ago you were insulting me and now you're jumping me. Oh, yeah, her temper was definitely getting the better of her. Well, sorry to say that my fancy is obviously easy to sway. She gave him one of those saccharine smiles that he'd seen only once and already despised in his guts. Mine isn't, and you know I'm in love with Sakura-chan. Ino rolled her eyes at that, and felt sorry for it because it made her head spin like there was no tomorrow. Naruto, repeating it aloud will not make it mutual, so you can stop embarrassing yourself now and let the past go. How did they always end up bickering? It was saddening, truly. But one thing was sure, he wasn't going to leave anytime soon. The kiss served its purpose. Besides shaking her self-esteem a bit. Oh, that's definitely a great way of getting into someone's pants. Go on and insult their silly little crushes, or however you call it, because you are so above such frivolous things like affection and compassion and the like, aren't you? Believe it or not, Naruto, I am not emotionless. She scowled deeply before continuing. And how can you actually call yourself a man? How can you prefer billboard brow over me? Look at me. She stood up on her knees on the bed for emphasis. I am every man's wet dream. The blonde Junin shook his unruly haired head in disbelief. Well, you are not my wet dream. And where do you go off judging people's masculinity simply because they're not smitten with you? Just what is wrong with you today? It was immeasurably difficult to pretend that what he'd said hadn't struck a nerve. Hard. It was even more difficult to ignore the rest of what he'd said, save for one thing which, for some reason, cut the deepest. Oh, am I now? She muttered beneath her breath, changing tack too quick to slip his notice. You prefer forehead girl over me. It was as if she was talking to herself in low volumes. It was really demented and he didn't appreciate it. It was creeping him out. And you believe that you love her? I don't believe. I know, and you should too, she's your best friend. Ino was positively seething. On a night of death, she was reminded of a promise that she'd made before another loved one had died. She would not break that promise, the promise of her lifetime, and she would not lose to Sakura, at being a shinobi and in love. Even if she didn't want him that way or like him at all in that aspect, so she told herself. So the blonde girl stood up and walked over to Naruto, circling around him under his suspicious gaze. What are you scheming now? Don't make it sound as if I'm a terrible person with nothing better to do than to come up with stupid plans to get a rise out of people. She stopped in front of him, an indecipherable look in her eyes. She reached out and smoothed the inexistent wrinkles on his shirt. I was just thinking of putting this, in love with Sakura, theory to the test for you. She cocked her platinum-haired head slightly to the side, making her messy ponytail get a little looser. You know, just so you can say it confidently next time, I'll give you my best shot. Naruto had been about to demand what she was raving on about before he was shoved into the nearest wall and pulled down by his neck into a searing kiss. You see, Ino was a horribly sore loser. There were very few things she wouldn't do to win, and it is a widely known fact that all is fair in love and war. And since she was having a competition in both with the wide forehead, she only saw it fitting to throw in some tongue play in there. Her guinea pig though wasn't as ecstatic as she was about this whole deal. Uzumaki Naruto was a truly devoted boy, and when he chose someone, he chose to last. Minor obstacles and setbacks would not hinder him from achieving his ultimate goal, and when Sakura finally saw what he'd been seeing all along, it would all be worth it. No one believed it would happen, but nobody had believed in his constant blather about becoming a Hokage, and now half of Konoha was rooting for him as Rokudaime. Because he'd made it possible, because he'd made them believe, made them see what he'd always seen. Why should his love life be any different? Therefore he considered himself spoken for, which was the reason he was so irked by the fact someone he'd been just about ready to let into his life as a close friend, if even just because of her close relationship to the woman he loved with all his might, was letting her hands touch him in ways he'd rather she didn't. She was all over him, exploring, kissing, ravishing and grinding. Clothes against clothes, chest against chest, she rubbed herself on him, showering passionate kisses all over his face and down his neck, which was far more accessible to her given she was almost a head shorter than him. His body was starting to react, but it would to anyone who behaved like that. He was a healthy 22-year-old man, after all. When her way too adventurous for his taste hands reached his belt and were about to make a go for it, though, he saw that it had to stop. He grabbed both of her hands firmly, trying his best to keep from hurting her, though on a subconscious level he really wanted to, or not that subconscious. He gathered them in his left. He could hold both her tiny wrists with just one hand, and made her look at him with his other. His expression was a rare one of absolute seriousness. Ino, stop. She pulled away slowly. You're just drunk and upset. It'll pass. She shook her head vigorously before looking away. There were fresh tears in her eyes. She really didn't take well to rejection. This isn't what you want, it's just the alcohol you had speaking. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They were strained and forced words. I'm going to be just fine, like you said. It'll pass and then I'll be great again. If her voice hadn't cracked, he would have believed she would. She was a really convincing liar, especially when she had her back to him. Make no mistake, Uzumaki Naruto was spoken for, to a lady worth all his time and affections. But he was also a person who'd go to great lengths for the sake of his friends. Even the newly acquired ones. Especially the newly acquired ones. He took a step and then another until his chest was flush against her back. He inhaled deeply, and then lightly bent his neck to plant a tentative kiss on her exposed neck. Another followed it soon, and by the third his hands were gently massaging her shoulders. And this time both noticed how much larger his palms were than hers. He could cover her entire shoulder with one of his hands easily. But the discovery was lost to yet another tender kiss that traveled a little farther up the column of her neck. Do you feel anything from that? He asked her in a voice barely above a whisper in her ear. Ino knew that there was some kind of right answer to that. She knew that, and she just had to find it. Again, she was drunk, not stupid. Nothing, she returned in the same volume. See, that's all the proof you need to calm you down, that it's just the alcohol. He smiled and backed away from her. She was unpleasantly aware of the disappearance of his body's warmth. It made her feel like she was in a freezing cold room instead of the comfy temperature of her abode. She nodded and went to sit on her bed. Before her legs gave out beneath her for lying through her teeth. Before the flock of butterflies burst out of her tummy, because this was not a little white lie she'd just said. Because, if that little stunt had been proof for anything, it was that it wasn't the alcohol speaking, and that she needed to sit because she had a problem that hadn't been there before he'd sat down next to her at that bar. You'll be good as new tomorrow morning, I promise you that. He smiled reassuringly at her, but she wasn't looking. He didn't let it faze him one bit though. You just need to get some rest, is all. Usually, this kind of discovery was cause of happiness, for giddiness and for excitement. Not in her case though. It was mortifying. And the light that she'd been holding onto for the entire night like a drowning man to a lifeline was flickering and slipping away from her grip, just like light always tended to do. And she was horrified of the darkness that she just noticed was embracing the whole room, the darkness that was encompassing her heart. Ino pulled her knees up and embraced them with unsteady arms. Her companion noted that as well. I think I should get going now, but if you need something, anything, you know where to find me. He looked at her, as if to assure himself she'd be fine, before turning to go for the door. But he didn't make it very far. Actually, a shaky voice began, cracking under emotion. There is something. He was back by her side in a breath. It was really amazing. What is it? He asked in a hushed voice as he sat down next to her huddled figure. She didn't say anything for a while, fighting an internal battle that she was bound to lose someday or another. This is going to be so humiliating, she muttered to herself while burying her face in her knees. Well, if it will make you feel any better, I could share a ton of humiliating stories after that. He laughed lightly and she felt a bit more certain about saying what she wanted to say. He had the most mysterious of ways to make someone relax, and it seemed he did it so naturally, soothe people's fears. All the more reason to try to get this out of her system. Naruto, she sounded like she was a hair's breadth away from a mental breakdown. I'm just so afraid. He didn't know what to do with a crying girl. He really had hoped it wouldn't come to that. He knew the basics, but he really sucked at consoling people. You're probably going to laugh at me, she sniffed long and hard. But I can't help it. I tried to fight it, but it won't go. What won't? He prompted, his voice lighter than ever before, coercing, coaxing, tentative not to be the last thing that would make the proverbial dam break. She looked at him with tear-strained cheeks through the darkness of the room, and he was taken aback. He would have never thought Ino capable of crying. Ino was, well, Ino, and crying was for girls like Sakura, who were over-emotional and delicate, fragile. He'd just never considered Ino was as well. I'm so afraid of the dark, Naruto, she whimpered, before starting to rock lightly back and forth onto her comfortable mattress. It was true that Naruto was uncomfortable with showing affection and giving consolation. He knew what to do generally, but he just didn't have it in him, the thing that made a good consoler. In this case though, he spared no time gathering the small ball that Ino had curled into in his arms, resting his back against her bedpost and embracing her tightly while caressing her head gently. Because Uzumaki Naruto was one of the people who were well acquainted to the dark and knew what it felt to be afraid of it, to be scared out of your wit about the monsters that might lurk in it. He had been born in darkness and raised in it. But he refused to lose himself or any of his friends to it. That night, Naruto stayed over at Ino's. And, unbeknownst to either of them, began to guide a stray soul back to shore, little at a time. Ino considered her fear of the dark one of her most irrational and nonsensical traits, but ordinarily she is a girl abiding by the rules of cold logic, and cold logic dictated that, in the cycle of time, after dark there is light, after night there is day. And each and every night that she shuddered lightly before falling asleep in the pitch blackness of her bedroom, the only calming thought she had in mind that the sun would come up tomorrow and banish everything that happened at night, keep it strictly in the boundaries of the dark, that she'd be a different, better person when her eyes opened again next time. And each and every day it was the same, with the horror of the night behind her. She'd spend a good minute or 5 assuring herself that there was nothing to be such a sissy about, that everything was alright, that it was time to rid herself of this irrational and nonsensical phobia of hers because it deterred her growth as a ninja. She would exhale slowly, shakily, and once the breath was out, she truly became a better, stronger person. Each and every day repeated the previous, a vicious circle of torrid emotions tearing at her heart every godforsaken night, an overcritical mind confronting her about her weaknesses that she just couldn't seem to eliminate the way she'd been able to with every other before it. And so, she kept living in the hell that her subconscious mind created for her, falling asleep to fear every night and waking up to herself bashing for it every morning, over and over and over again, till the end of her time, or sanity. For Ino had tried everything to lose this unnatural fear of hers and was convinced that there was no ridding of it anymore. All she had left was to steel her mind in this prison built solely of darkness because she abided by cold logic. And cold logic knew that where there is light, there is darkness. But not everywhere there's darkness there is light. And that was why at 22, Yamanaka Ino was still terrified of the dark. Per usual, Ino stirred from her sleep several times a night due to her turbulent nocturnal visions that more often than not ended up in full-blown nightmares. She had grown used to it long ago, or more likely to the thought of it, because there was no way anyone could get used to something unpleasant to the point of it not bothering them anymore. It's just one of those things that don't happen. This was why the blonde girl was surprised when her sleepy eyes were met by the cheerfulness of the bright morning light seeping through the curtains that she always had infallibly drawn wide open before her large windows. Judging by the shadows her furniture was casting on her floor, it was well into the day, 11 at best. Her still inadequate mind became very aware of the excruciating splitting headache that had seized her in a vice-like grip. The remembrance of the shot glasses overturned on the counter for easier counting swum to the surface of her attention, mocking her for lack of anything better to do. She didn't have much time to beat herself up over her stupidity though, as just as suddenly she realized that her pillow was warm even in places that weren't in contact with her skin. And there's no way pillows had natural warmth since they were inanimate bloodless objects, and if there was no blood flowing within them, there was no warmth coming from them. You didn't need to be a genius or even a ninja to know that, it's common sense. And yet her pillow had warmth. As a matter of fact, it had a pulse too, a soothing, calm heartbeat that she could hear the thumping just below where her head was resting on it. She was a bit slow on the uptake after blowing her mind away quite successfully with a rather large two-digit number of alcohol shots the previous day, but Ino realized very well that something was amiss when she noticed that her pillow also had a pair of legs. A pair of masculine legs. And a very nice pair though they were, and she had to try embarrassingly hard not to let her mind drift in a completely different direction with its start that same thought. She felt a stab of panic rise in her despite her better judgment that no matter how stoned she got there was no way she'd let in a stranger in her house or her bed. Then again the alternative of having someone she knew in her bed seemed equally as disturbing when she considered it. Her mind was being really helpful to her that day because, although admittedly it was the one that had her thinking weird stuff in the first place, it spared her a minute of agonizing over the consequences of something she dare not face by reminding her with a fresh torrent of flashbacks that she hadn't slept, or at least not in that sense of the word, with anyone, and that Naruto had cradled her. How utterly humiliating that was in broad daylight. While she fell asleep, and then he'd gone home, sometime during the night. Again, there was no way to be sure about that last part. She was taking a wild, and logical, dare she say, guess about what could have happened after she'd gone out like a light in his arms. Again, how embarrassing a thought, but considering that her head lay on a pillow that had warmth, a heart and legs, she began to consider it safe to say that Naruto had indeed not gone home while she slept. How infinitely nice a predicament that was, wouldn't you agree? Telling someone your greatest secret of all time, the first time that those words have ever come out of your mouth in that order, and next thing you know you have to deal with the consequences of your confession first thing in the morning. She felt that headache more acutely than ever in that exact moment. When she tried to pry herself away from his torso, she noticed the massive forearm that was still lying securely on her back, holding her in place for what seemed the entire night. She suppressed a grunt, a mixture of pain from the pounding headache and overexertion with her attempts to free herself, and tilted her head a little to the side so his profile would be visible to her. The girl was slightly taken aback by the fact that he was actually awake. That fact made her turn her attention to a much more pressing issue. He was awake and in her bed, with his hand still on her back. That at least called for a vocal recognition of some sort, if not anything else a shriek of surprise. Of course, seeing as Ino wasn't all that surprised or alarmed about it, she had time to regard the question with a bit more of that cold-blooded logic that she so prided herself for. And just that aforementioned logic dictated that remarking, "You're still here," was not much of an attention grabber. Sure, she would say it with a hopeful and happy tone, but minding the hell she'd put him through the previous day, as well as the resentful aspect that she'd used that same phrase with him, she doubted he'd pay as much attention to her tone as to her actual words after waking up next to him after he'd gone out of his way to help her out. Even after she'd challenged his feelings for Sakura, and, goodness gracious, she just cursed all the divinities up there that it was anatomically impossible to kick herself in the ass for this second one, his masculinity. So, instead, she chose to settle for the well-tried, old method. Hey, She greeted lamely with the beginnings of an uneasy smile on her surely dreadfully looking face. She was surprised to see a startled look cross his stilled features before he turned to acknowledge her. He gave her a lazy, tired smile in return. Hey, he echoed, giving her the chance to hear his voice, a barely audible croak, scratchy with disuse. Yet another odd thing on this bizarre morning of unnatural occurrences. Didn't notice you were up. The blonde nodded slowly at him and felt his arm unwind from around her, and she squashed the stab of disappointment the moment it rose within her, giving her some more space to move but didn't seem in a particular hurry to remove himself from her bed anytime soon. Not that she minded, which was the most puzzling things of all. Eno even took the time to notice how much more mature it made him look when he donned on that wistful expression of someone very deep in thought. And it took more than a little self-conviction to slow down the suddenly uneven rate of her heart, which was frankly silly of her. Asking if he were there the whole time would have been a bit too much on the questioning the obvious side that she tried not to venture into, for people who did otherwise were often thought of lesser intelligence, which she was not, so she settled for querying him about something a bit more subtle. Something she had mixed feelings debating with herself. Have you had any sleep at all? It came out a bit more incredulous of a tone than she'd aimed for. For a while, Naruto just kept staring off into space, as if he didn't hear her question or deemed it unworthy of his acknowledgement. You said you were afraid of the dark, so I stayed up and made sure there was nothing in here for you to be afraid of. Ah, leave it to Naruto to say the sweetest thing when you're just about to jump down his neck for his condescending act. Oh, squashing away the utterly bewildered note in her voice proved to be quite a feat, but she considered she did well with it when she continued, equally as lamely as she had all morning, if she may say so herself. Well, thanks then, I guess. She noted to herself that forcing smiles when they aren't even noticed or she's not even in the mood for one was definitely a bad idea. Her face felt like she'd scrunched it up for a painful grimace rather than a reassuring, if a little crooked, smile. Naruto nodded thoughtfully, still looking dazedly into nothing in particular, and she couldn't help but stare this time. Because there was something very different about the guy, bathed in the bright morning light that couldn't even rival his internal radiance, which, by the way, was on even higher top-notch than it was last night when he'd helped her overcome herself. There was something just changed, something that made him appear that much more a man rather than a ditzy boy, but she couldn't put her finger on what exactly it was. When her eyes wandered to the nightstand by her bedpost and she turned her gaze back on him, she knew. At some point in time he'd taken off his Konoha forehead protector. And, somehow, without it he looked so much better on so many levels that she couldn't even begin to grasp why it was that way. Sure, with the thing on, he was so uniquely Naruto that it could make you go blind just looking at him, showing off that will of fire that was said all Konoha nins possessed, wearing his dreams wrapped around his forehead for the world to see, to know that he would one day protect the whole village and would even lay down his life for them should the need arise. Without it, he wasn't blabbering nonsense about becoming Hokage one day Naruto. Without it, he was someone she'd never laid eyes on before, because she really hadn't seen him without it. Somehow, without the forehead protector, it seemed that he could look at the world a bit more realistically, like he could look at everything without his rose-colored goggles. His eyes were dimmer, more unfocused, as if trying to grasp the inadvertent hope that he usually possessed and failing at it, because he could see, actually see, the world around him, the world he lived in. And with it came a new light from him. Certainly, not as blindingly bright as the usual one, and at the same time so much more soothing, so much calming exactly because of his, more reserved behavior, because of its slight subtleness that coaxed one into a sense of utter tranquility. She felt idiotic for thinking such things just for the lack of one metal-plated bandana around a guy's head, but it was the only thing she could think of to justify her sudden change of opinion on the person who she'd previously envisioned as the blonde abomination, and that disastrous Hokage wannabe. Besides, He looked really deep in thought, if not serene, sitting there with his eyes so unfocused like that. She bit on her lower lip hard to derail her train of thought from the unhealthy direction it was heading in before it crashed on its own. Then the previous short-lived conversation finally sank in and she looked puzzled at her friend. So, you sat here, all night long, immersed in thought like this? She could barely fit the idea in her mind. What was left for actually believing someone she barely knew would do something like that just for her sake? He chuckled lightly. What a rich sound that was when his voice wasn't its usual shrill pitch, at that, and put his arms behind his neck. And it was really hard not to notice that he'd lost the shirt he'd had on last night when his well-toned muscled arms seemed to stare right back at her, though in a much more show-off-like style. Yeah, I guess that pretty much sums it up. Feeling more and more ridiculous, not to mention humiliated at the thoughts that ran through her head, Ino grabbed at the first topic that she could think of to take her mind off the track it wouldn't stop being on. And she was bit too acutely aware of the closeness of their lower halves for comfort. What were you thinking of for such a long time? Lots of stuff, he said in a tone that clearly conveyed that he would not appreciate being interrogated any further about it. Ino knew well that kind of tone because most of her subjects during her training sessions with Ibiki-senpai used it, unsuccessfully, on her. But this was Naruto, a completely new and unsuspectingly existing one, and she decided to just let it go this time. Even if she hadn't, the alarm clock on her nightstand began shrieking in that godforsaken deafening way it usually did, gaining their attention immediately. The blonde girl did them both a favor by slamming her hand on it to prevent it from waking the entire block. Well, he sighed as he threw his feet over the edge of the bed, disentangling himself from her. Much to her chagrin, although she'd hotly deny it if asked, I think that would be my cue to leave. She kind of hoped he would forget it there, so she'd be able to get rid of it because of the unfairness it did to his unruly blonde locks that the world preferred unhindered, but the headband was the first thing he took when he got up, after which he collected his shirt and swiftly put it on. I'll let you take care of that headache and just tell me if you need me to make up an excuse to Ibiki-san or Tsunade Baba so you can, recuperate for one day, steer clear of the loudly speaking people. He was by the door of her bedroom faster than she would have liked him to, but she didn't let any of her feelings show on her face save for one as she smiled gratefully. Thanks, Naruto. He looked at her with a grin on his face as he made to tie the forehead protector around his head. For being such a great friend when I was anything but. It means a lot to me. She blinked a few times embarrassedly, which he noted distinctly, before leaning in conspiratorially. And I'd be forever more thankful to you if you kept what I told you last night to yourself. Her voice lowered to a mere whisper and she cringed slightly as she said, it's not exactly bragging material. At that it seemed all his bodily processes halted and changed course a bit, and that foreign look took over his features once more. His hands dropped to his sides again, one firmly grasping the metal plate of his protector. He was staring at the wall in front of him with a wistful expression again before he nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. I can keep a secret for you. The grin on his face at that moment when he turned to her appeared more sincere than all the other ones she'd ever seen him give. It made her feel somehow lighter and oddly ill at ease in the abdominal area to look at. I'll give you a heads up as your senior in these matters, Ino-chan. The demons of the night aren't as scary as the darkness makes them seem. They only come out after dark because they can only exist within it. In the daytime you see their real faces and they're not as frightening anymore, either real or imaginary. He turned to leave again but stopped once more on the threshold, biting on his lips in what looked like an attempt to conceal a smile. And even the real demons aren't always as mortifying and untouchable as the legends make them. So you should keep in mind that there was a great deal of exaggeration of their powers in the darkness when the stories were written as well. He winked at her and exited her apartment, letting her decipher what exactly he'd just tried to tell her. But at any rate she was glad that he was gone. She would have been horrified to explain the blush that contrasted so vividly with her pale facial features. especially when she had only a too vague idea why the blush was. The door to the eerily quiet room opened. A light suddenly bathed all its bitingly white appliances. A small, bare foot with skin of a tone so like the rest of the whiteness in the premise stepped in, onto the tiled floor with an uncertain step. A shiver ran up the slender leg as the mind-numbing cold of the tile ensnared the warmth of the foot, instantly robbing it of its heat. Instead of retreating at the onslaught of an unpleasant sensation, the slim frame of a naked girl clutching a towel to her front made her way inside the bathroom, closing the door behind her, reveling at the feeling of the freezing sensation seeping into her from her feet to her entire body. She made her way to the shower stall, her feet pattering against the tiles along the way. A mane of pure platinum was released from its strict prison with a small hair band coming off, which was temporarily airborne until it landed on the shelf in front of a large mirror. The beautiful locks spilled around her like liquid silk, trying to hide her from herself, to mask her shame at the thoughts that incessantly ran through her head, choking the very essence of her. The pretty-haired head hung low against the collarbone of the individual, as if the telephone shower was her severest judge and she was tongue-tied, with nothing to say in her defense. There was only resounding silence in the room of pure whiteness when a slender, well-toned arm struck out from the sea of platinum to rest the weight of the body against a wall when the legs alone didn't suffice. For a while, all the cornflower pupilless blue eyes did was stare numbly at the shower's spout, trying to convince their owner out of the incredulity of her thoughts because they were simply preposterous. Things like that did not happen overnight. People did not change overnight and neither did their opinions of one another. A second slim hand reached out and turned the water on, adjusting the temperature until it was perfect to put the head with the glorious blonde mane under it. In a matter of seconds, the beautiful platinum locks were soaked, shining with a new brilliance with the infusion of the water in them. She was a creature of the dark, a child of the night in the worst possible meaning, and it was moments like these when she succumbed to it that made it obvious. For her thoughts and musings were blacker than tar, just like her heart was, how it had always been. Unfeeling, never beating. She was a creature ugly at heart, with a tiny, despicable soul, one who emanated only loathe and darkness with its lurid aura. People like her did not fall for creatures of the light, the bright and cheerful ones, the ones who seem more radiant than the clearest day, overnight. Her opinions did not change overnight. She was a person of principles. What would that say about her principles if they were superficial enough to be changed by just one evening of good behavior on someone's part? Gods, she was pathetic. Was that why people so easily came to hate each other and start wars, killing hundreds of innocents? Because they could love equally as quickly, equally as shallowly. How revolting a thought. She was not in love. She was just vulnerable, and alone, and downright pitiful. A lost cause. The type that he loved to busy himself with. And that was exactly why he had cared. Because she was a lost cause. Why did it have to be the dead last who she took a sudden strange fancy in? Why couldn't it have been someone cool and mature and, more her type, like Shikamaru? Or even Neji? She was so distraught that she wasn't even sure what her type was anymore. Because if she followed that train of thought, she'd arrive back at her first love. And thus she'd be able to conclude that her type would be people that made her shiver with fear at night at the sheer memory of them and made her blood curdle in her veins when she encountered them. And that was even more than pathetic, though no human vocabulary had a word strong enough to describe it. Lord, she'd fallen so low she was just a speck from the spot everyone else was. She was needy and Naruto had been her friend in need. And her insecure weakened heart had latched onto him like a drowning man to a lifeline. But she knew better than to believe in that feeling. It was just as imaginary as the haunting crimson seas with jet black windmills in her mind's eye. And it would be gone just as quickly, with the break of dawn, as all other imaginary things were, she decided as she began to bathe herself. Because people's opinions of others did not change overnight, because people did not change that easily. Because you can't fall in love so quickly, for such superficial and just stupid, nonsensical, reasons. For that would mean that people can grow to hate one another equally as strongly for just the same meager reasons. And that was just such a soul-scaring notion she refused to entertain it even for a second. The next time Ino saw Naruto, it was well over a few days since the whole pub episode, and she'd had enough time to calm down and persuade herself out of her crush on the loud fellow blonde, or, rather, that there was never a crush to talk herself out of in the first place. And that was just so easy to believe since she'd never really cared too much for the guy before. She was rifling through papers with a disgruntled look on her face, sitting on a bench in front of the Hokage Tower on a sunny day when a shadow fell over her documents. With a fine brow quirked slightly in annoyance, she'd lifted her eyes up from the large hands jammed in the loose, atrociously orange, pants up to the grinning, slightly bent over her frame of Uzumaki Naruto. She gave him a sardonic smile. "Hello there, Boulder boy," she greeted sourly when he didn't get the point of the look she was giving him. "Not that I mind too much you getting in the way of my hopelessly important work, but would you mind moving? I really should finish this sooner. Hokage-sama might feel the need to vent her frustrations with me on my body with her fists, and you should know that this kind of thing never ends well." Naruto laughed full-heartedly at that, and she did her best to ignore him despite the fact he was yet to do as she'd asked. Otherwise, thoughts she denied so well over the past few days could have resurfaced. "She sure can punch hard, huh? Don't worry though, if it's your first offense, I'm sure she'll go easy with the amount of chakra she channels to her fist." He chuckled some more when he sat right next to her, their sides only an inch or two apart. Ino rolled her eyes at his words, because admit it or not, she was trying to keep her attention strictly and only at that, him talking. "Yeah, well, my head isn't as thick as yours is, so I'd rather not try." Her patience. The pen in her dainty fingers scribbled her curvy signature on several places while she was talking to him. "I would say that is rather debatable." The look she gave him only made him laugh, which was definitely not the effect she was striving for. Sorry. He apologized hastily, knowing better than to try a female's temper. He'd been on the receiving end of far too many way too powerful punches from girls that look petite and delicate, which only went to prove that looks, especially regarding kunoichi, can be very deceiving, to not develop some sense of self-defense, though he was still greatly lacking in that aspect. He leaned back on the bench, draping his chiseled arms over the back of it for better relaxation. Ino kept ignoring him. "So, what have you been up to lately? Haven't seen you around much." She was really just a beginner at caring enough to even try to read people, but she was quite certain that beneath that casual tone he was harboring a bit of worry over her well-being. She didn't know what to make of it, so she just shunned the thought from her mind completely and switched back to ignoring everything and everyone. For a moment she almost, ironically, could understand why Sasuke had liked it so much, the blissful oblivion of not giving a damn about anything. Needless to say, she mentally smacked herself out of the thought the very second she conceived it. "Oh, you know how it goes, same shit, different day." He began to nod in affirmation when her head bolted up slightly from being hunched over the documentation she was dealing with. "Although I did decide to make a hobby out of that night. Get hammered like hell, wake up next to a different person every morning after a night of wild experiences, that kind of stuff." He laughed again, and she assured herself that it was not because of it that she'd said that kind of obvious lie. His face fell soon though, mirth replaced so quickly by dread that it was quite amusing. "That was a joke, right?" he asked her in all seriousness, and she couldn't help but chortle a bit at his gullibility. Of course it was a joke. They shared a chuckle before Ino cocked an eyebrow at him. "Geesh, what kind of girl do you take me for anyway?" "Well, what kind of girl are you trying to make yourself out to be?" he parried, a smug look on his face. It took Ino some time to convince herself she was not flirting with Uzumaki freaking Naruto. There was a tranquil silence broken only by the throng of people all around them, going to and fro the Hokage Tower and down the narrow streets of Konoha, the occasional turning of a page and scribble of the pen in her hand. So, really, how are you holding up? Things looking up at length. He tried again for a conversation and she decided to dignify this attempt with stopping her constant autographing this page and that. She regarded his question earnestly for a short moment that caught his complete and undivided attention once more. He was looking expectantly at her profile when she deduced. Well, if I have to be frank, she began and was partially annoyed when he picked that exact spot to raise an open palm in her face to stop her talking. She did not appreciate much being interrupted after being asked a question that expected an answer. Should I steel myself for any snarky remarks or sarcasm now that you're going to be frank? She stared at his genuine expression with her mouth agape. When she seemed to come out of her stasis, she let out an indignant snort, putting her pen down on her papers. Naruto smirked at her, daring her to say anything to that, but, considering her attitude towards him, there was really nothing she could really rebuke him with that would be even remotely true. So she rolled her eyes in mild annoyance and crossed her arms over her ample chest. Oh, Kay. So I wasn't the nicest person ever, but there's no need to rub it in my face, you know. Hey, it was just a question. He interjected with what he probably dubbed his charming smile. Or was that her dubbing it his charming smile? Now that's some food for thought. His arms went up in a defensive manner. Better prepare myself than be caught off guard, you know. No snarky remarks or sarcastic comments. She seemed to rethink that for a bit before she corrected herself, or at least none meant for you. That I can live with. They cackled again before continuing. Things have been awful since Mom and Dad, you know. Her voice trailed off and her spirits visibly dampened, so even if he didn't know, he would have found out at that exact moment. He nodded slowly, adopting a deadpan expression of his own. But, besides the emotional background, everything's turning out pretty well. I'm handing over Daddy's last mission reports that he'd forgotten to deal with, getting things for the funeral arranged and trying to get back on track with work. Her eyes unfocused and he was sure she was no longer staring at the paper sheets in her hands but at the times past. Naruto expelled a sigh. He really wasn't made out for this kind of heavy atmosphere. It stifled the very thing that was uniquely him. So he did the one thing that he was very good at in these situations. Sounds like life's been pretty boring for you. Change the subject to something completely unrelated to what he had been talked to about. Ino looked skeptically at him. Well, yeah, it's not as if I'm going to throw a party because my parents died, she almost hissed out venomously at him, her voice thick with malice. The blonde boy put up a pacifying palm again. No, that just didn't come out right. What I meant is that you need a change of pace. This time the light-haired girl regarded him with mildly intrigued dubiousness. Noticing her sudden attentiveness, her companion went on to pursue his idea more thoroughly. What do you say we go grab some lunch? I'm starving and I'm sure that you could use some reinforcement to deal with that huge stack of tedious paperwork. He grinned hopefully at her. Just a few weeks ago, she might have brushed off an offer like that the second he decided to proposition her. But so much had changed in that little time that it was barely fathomable. If anything else, she truly regarded the thought with some degree of seriousness. Sure, she hated ramen and it was most certainly what he had in mind to take her to, since it was probably the sole thing he lived on, but the mere fact that he'd stick around and shed some of that encompassing brightness of his that had one hopelessly dark night given her comfort and the best, nightmare less too, sleep for the first time in a long while made her reconsider her refusal. Folding the documents neatly, she looked up at his grinning mug with a smile on her own. Lunch sounds acceptable. Naruto gave her a victory sign with his right hand and led the way to the place he had in mind. But before he could say anything, she added, as long as it's not miso ramen, instant ramen or anything resembling whatever ramen like. Her blonde fellow looked as though he had been lethally struck with a kunai in a vital area. You don't like ramen? She feigned thinking over his query. No, it's not that I don't like ramen, his features relaxed into a blissful relief once more. I rather hate it. And he tripped over his own feet, falling flat on his face in the middle of the completely even, obstacle-less street. How can you hate ramen? Ramen is the best food in the entire world. An azure pair of eyes rolling in irritation. Okay. So for me, it isn't. What can't you accept about that? Why can't you make your peace with the fact that I'm not a fan of your food? An indignant, sharp intake of breath. Because, gears of a slow brain turning frantically for a little while, mouth flapping open and closed in a perfect imitation of a goldfish. There's no way you can't like ramen once you know how much fun it can be. A disbelieving snort. Food isn't supposed to be fun, you goof. It's supposed to be nutritious and healthy and low on calories so it doesn't ruin your figure. Personally, I think that you've become so much of only skin and bones that nothing can ruin your so-called figure. A pointed glare. Here's a tip from me. You're not going to cajole me into eating your dish from hell by insulting me. A cerulean pair of eyes rolling in dejection. Just give me one try, okay? You'll see that you'll love ramen. A sigh of resignation. Fine. I'd like to see you try to change my mind about it. An hour or so later, and the complete demonstration of the 24 fun uses of ramen behind her back, Ino could safely say that she wasn't so averse to the dish anymore. A couple of weeks so and the occasional lunch or dinner at the Ichiraku's brought Ino a bit closer to understanding what made Naruto tick, especially when it came to his food. The meetings began with remotely awkward at first, traversed through comfortable small talk to finally arrive at cozy confabulation. The girl could now safely say that she was one of Uzumaki Naruto's closest circle of friends, and she found herself quite enjoying that position. She also no longer really hated ramen, though she very, very rarely indulged in it herself. Yes, she could definitely do without ramen but didn't resent it that much anymore. Because ramen was really fun. Though what made it fun was the boy who could make her laugh even though her parents had recently passed on. She had no doubt in her mind she could do without him, she was completely self-sufficient. Always had been, always would be. She could definitely do without him. She just didn't want to anymore. For Ino had found a single small candle whose light even all the darkness in the world couldn't extinguish. About 3 months after the blossoming of the blonde's unforeseen friendship, Naruto was dazedly walking the streets of Konoha, mind wandering about when would be the best time to go off on a lunch break because his genin team was being quite a handful that day. He'd barely shaken them off a few minutes ago under the pretext that he had to talk something over with Tsunade Baba, leaving them to hone their shuriken throwing skills on their own. He had a feeling he'd have a lot of helping to do once he came back to see the results. In fact, the youth was so deep in thought that he narrowly missed running into a rather large bunch of walking bouquets. He started having doubts about them, though, when they mumbled a hasty apology in a small as tall as an ant voice and started stumbling forward and backward, nearly losing their balance. Ino-chan, he guessed tentatively when he caught a glimpse of pencil-straight platinum hair sticking out of a strikingly neat high ponytail. The bunch of bouquets froze in place and there was some general wrapping paper ruffling before a pretty head stuck out from between them to greet him. "Oh, Naruto, hi. If I knew it was you I ran into, I would have been more polite." She gave a half-hearted laugh and hoisted the flowers in a bit more comfortable position to hold while talking to someone. The boy quickly scrambled to aid her in the dire flower situation she seemed to be having. "Ah, now that's a load off my hands, literally. Thanks," she said once they delivered most of the bouquets to their destinations safe and sound. "So you've decided to take up the family business?" He dramatically dabbed his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt. "More or less." She watched from the window her latest customer, a pretty middle-aged gentle-looking woman, tend to the flowers as though they were fragile. It brought a small smile to her pinkish lips. "I felt like I'd be letting my folks down if I didn't. Besides, it's a great getaway every now and then. The flower field, and the best retirement plan a kunoichi could ever wish for. Naruto was looking at her with a bemused expression on his face. Retirement, he reiterated, making her turn in her puzzlement to size him up too. Yeah, retirement, she emphasized, as if it was a brand new word to his vocabulary. Some of us are thinking in perspective here. Yeah, quite a perspective there. 40 years into the future is indeed quite perspectively, I have to agree. And that comment earned him a nod light enough to be just playful punch on the shoulder. Well, that is in case I make it to retirement. Her demeanor suddenly became grim. A lot of ninjas never do. And he had a very clear idea whom she was envisioning when she said that. True, many don't, it's part of being a ninja after all. But I think you're going to be one of the few who will make it to old age. He smirked mischievously when he saw an opportunity to turn that frown of hers upside down at the slight twitch in the corner of her mouth at his previous statement. In fact, I think that you're going to live for so long that about the time your number comes up, you'll be all old and wrinkly. Ino smacked his arm again at that, but her attempts to submerge the grin were becoming poorer and poorer. And cranky, and you're going to throw stuff with shuriken hidden in them at little genin kids who dare trespass in your personal garden in the back of your filthy rich husband's mansion. You, for one, seem to have a very clear image of my future, She gave him an amused smirk while unlocking the front door to the Yamanaka flower shop. Naruto thumped a fist to his chest smugly. Of course. In my spare time, when I take a small breather from being a walking legend, Ino laughed aloud at that, I develop my other great talent, being a psychic. He was positively beaming when he crossed his arms over his broad chest. She just felt compelled to get him off his high horse. Are you sure that you're not just psychotic? He mocked an injured look. Is it not enough that I give you insights on your bright future for free, but you also insult me? How horribly ungrateful of you. He put the back of his palm to his forehead for additional drama. Ino rolled her eyes from him. Don't you think it's getting old? At her words, his hand immediately dropped to his side and he resumed a normal pose. Yeah, I was thinking of quitting soon, it really was getting old. He watched her as she rearranged the flowers in a vase by the counter while shaking her head in disbelief at the guy's behavior. So, if there's anything else I can help you with, what with you getting the shop running again and all, don't hesitate to tell me, anytime, alright? The blonde gave him an appreciative smile. Thanks, Naruto. I will if I have trouble with something. Anytime's fine. I know, she said more forcefully. You should get back to your team, I'm sure they've started fussing about now. He cursed softly while checking the ornamented clock on the wall of the shop. Man, I can't believe I skipped lunch and it's already this late. He heaved a great sigh. You're right. I should get back to them before they start causing trouble for Neji's kids or Choji's cell. I'll see you around, okay. She nodded her affirmation and turned back to her flowers. Anytime you need help, don't hesitate to call, right? I know, go already. She all but chased him out. Alright, I'm going already, geez, no need to get testy. The door to the shop clicked shut and quiet reigned over the place. But Ino knew better than to enjoy the tranquility too much, because just a minute later the door opened again and a painfully familiar blonde head poked in. Do you by chance have any instant ramen lying around? I'm really starving to death here and kinda in a hurry. She sent him off a second time, empty-handed, and grumbling incessantly, but for some reason she just couldn't stop grinning like an imbecile. She felt like nothing could make the sun set upon her clear cloudless day. As a person abiding by the laws of logic, Ino should have seen it coming, should have known it would come, because there was never a day without night, a sunrise without a sunset, even in metaphors. As a creature of the darkness, surrounded by it, writhing in it, she should have known that it wouldn't let her bask in the light of day for long. The eclipse of her field day came in the form of Sakura returning from a long mission to Sunagakur just in time for her birthday. The first day of her return was the day just before the wretched holiday of hers, and, unsurprisingly, Naruto was her most fretful customer that day. Ino-chan, I really need your help because I want to make this day special for Sakura-chan, one she'll never forget. Ino's cornflower blue eyes rolled in annoyance at that. And how do I fit in that? You're a girl, the clumsy blonde began, making his friend roll her eyes some more, this time with rather deeply pronounced irritation. Oh, well spotted, she spat back, disappearing somewhere in the back of the store in an attempt to storm off for effect. No, I meant that you know what a girl wants to make her special day most special, starting from the kind of bouquet I should give her to the kind of dinner I should take her to. He whined and prostrated himself on the counter dejectedly, his arms hanging a little off the side of it. Come on, Ino-chan, you're her best friend and she's brushed me off so many times already. I want to make it impossible for her to do it this time because it really means a lot to me to spend this day with her. Reclining against a shelf, Ino chewed on the inside of her cheek debating whether or not to commit the equivalent of emotional suicide by helping her potential crush or something of the sort person to finally get through to the one true love of his life. She grimaced as though she was in great pain and her fingers' grip on her arms grew a little firmer. Please, Ino, you're the only person who can help me, the only one I would want to help me, if even just a tiny bit, I'll be eternally grateful to you. He was positively pathetic, lying on that counter like that and she couldn't help but pity him. She'd really become his friend these last few months and he'd become a great part of her life. And somehow she just didn't want to share him with Sakura, even though he'd never see her the way he saw the pink monster and she knew it. I know you have no use of helping me out but I'll think a way to make it up to you, just give me a little push in the right direction here, I'm really terrible at this dating thing. The blonde flower shop owner bristled visibly. How could he even think that she had only her own benefit in mind when helping him out? Sure, they got off on the wrong foot in the beginning but he should know better than to doubt her at that point of their friendship. She stormed out from her hiding place, glaring heatedly at the pathetic puddle with a tuft of unruly blonde hair atop of it that was once a perky Hokage wannabe. She slammed her open palm on the counter right next to the boy's nose, startling him out of his pitiful reverie. You want my help? Fine, I'll help you, but just with the bouquet. He opened his mouth to start raining his thanks on her, but she put up a hand and an immediate stop to whatever he intended to say. And only under the condition that you never, ever think of me as someone who looks for personal benefit in helping out a friend in need. You should know I am not that kind of person, Naruto. Her voice was angry and imperious, but she couldn't stifle the welling satisfaction when he nodded vigorously. I know you're not, it's just that. His shoulders sagged. God, I'm just so pathetic. He draped himself over the counter again. Ino sniffed snobbishly and patted his shoulder condescendingly. That's okay. I knew you were all along, but I'm still here with you, playing the good friend part. He gave her a sardonic smirk that she acknowledged with a smug one of her own. So, she began in a rather business-like tone, a birthday bouquet for our favorite billboard brow. The girl started to circle suspiciously around some vases with flowers. Naruto just watched her reverently and waited patiently for her verdict. I think a gardenia should figure in there somewhere, but should it be the highlight of the ensemble? She pondered to herself, a thoughtful index finger tip on her lower lip. Naruto simply followed her bee-line trek around the flower shop with a curious gaze. What exactly are we trying to say here? I need to know so I can focus on that. Her inquiring gaze at him seemed to shake him out of his induced trance. He cleared his throat loudly as if to shrug off the last of his pitiful stupor. All right, well, let's see now. Ino grimaced, to herself, guessing from his stalling that it was going to be a long day for her, but she'd already made a promise to him and knew she had to stick with it. And Ino proved to be right because, from there, all hell broke loose. On the 28th of March, Naruto had the most gorgeous and breathtaking bouquet for a certain pink-haired girl and a little better knowledge of the quirks of her likings than he had the week before. He got the date he had wanted for such a long time and was able to truly make this day special for the one most special girl in his life. Ino watched from afar as her friend took out her once rival for what she was certain would be the girl's most wonderful and thoughtful date in her life, with due thanks to a certain blonde clerk, and smiled bitterly to herself before getting back to her endless work in the shop. That night, Naruto felt the happiest man on earth as he lay content on his back in his bed, to have such wonderful friends and finally, some of the attention of his lifelong crush. And Ino. That night, Ino dreamt of bloodline limited crimson orbs and the chirping of 1,000 deadly birds. Hey there, Suave One, she greeted playfully, not at all how she felt like after a night of barely any sleep at all and horribly nightmare infested, when he swung about her in the Hokage Tower the next day. How'd your dream date go? She'd been his friend for a few months now, so she had learned to expect the unexpected from his quixotic nature, so she wasn't as taken aback when he seized her in a tight bear hug and squeezed her tight and just barely, not enough to make some of her bones crack under the pressure. It was perfect, Ino-chan. Thank you a million times over. I made use of all the things you told me she liked and I think I'm finally having some progress. Ino ignored the emotion that reared its ugly head at his statement and smiled brilliantly at him as though she didn't feel like she was losing her closest friend. Well, it was only natural that my timely and ingenious input would have had you win over some points. She smirked self-satisfyingly and crossed her arms smugly over her chest. You were my savior, my guardian angel. Thank you so much. I'm so happy I feel like I could kiss you all over. Whoa there, shouldn't you be saving your kisses for your girlfriend now? It was all she could do to keep her voice friendly and casual. Naruto gave a deep sigh at that, his face falling, and she reprimanded herself mentally for the sudden well of hope in her at his dejected look. Because that was anything but friendly of her and she was supposed to be his friend. We're not actually together right now, but I just know I'm making progress, and it will be some time before she lets me kiss her anywhere other than the cheek. Just as abruptly his mood brightened and his face lit up with exhilaration once again. But my persistence has paid off so far, so I'm going to keep it up, and I'm sure that some of these days I'll reach my goal. I believe in that. Ino sighed to herself and turned her gaze away from him. Because she believed that too. In recollection, she wouldn't have probably been able to pinpoint exactly when her nightmare's hold on her had loosened enough for her to just forget about them, and she would never make the connection between the night they started haunting her again and the events of the day leading to them. All she knew is that she barely had any rest after the end of March, and she had the distinct feeling that there was only impenetrable darkness inside her head, the candle which had lighted her way no longer within her grasp. If asked, she would be certain that her horrid nightly visions were not her way of drowning her consciousness, so she would not think of her closest friends' involvement with each other. No, it was rather her way of punishing herself for ever believing she would be able to crawl out of the accursed pit her fear of the dark had dug out for her soul to rot in. Because all hope and blind belief could ever get you is disappointment. And she really should have known better. It was her field after all, simple logic. Sakura-chan, doesn't Ino seem constantly tired to you lately? Asked Naruto over a cup of coffee after an all-nighter mission with his medic teammate while they sat in a cafeteria just outside Konoha after the successful completion of their job. The addressed girl looked oddly at him. I suppose, she ventured uncertainly, eyebrow quirking slightly. What brought you to that kind of deep observation? She took a sip of her hot chocolate. I dunno know. She just seems kind of off lately, I guess is all. He slurped his hot drink. Ino's a big girl, Naruto, and she can take care of herself. The pink-haired apprentice of the Hokage crossed her legs and leaned back on her chair with an air of finality. And I'm sure if there's a problem she needs help with solving, she'll tell me right away. We may have had a bit of falling out back in the day, but we're best buddies now. Trust me, she's fine. She took another dainty taste of her drink, and he had to admit, her conviction in her own words lulled him in a false sense of security of his own. Even though a more profound part of him knew better than to be led on by groundless reasoning. How are things with the new apartment coming along? She opted for a change in subject because she hadn't been Naruto's teammate during all these years without learning a thing or two about his worrywart nature. Along with how single-tracked his mind was. Everything's great. All that's left to do is move my stuff in. That's great. Congratulations. She patted his shoulder in a friendly manner. Now you can have all the space you could ever wish for. Yeah, well, obviously constantly putting your neck on the line for your village in missions no one else wants to take does have its benefits. Especially financial. They chuckled a bit before lapsing into comfortable silence. So, are you sure you don't want to share the abode? There's a whole bedroom you can have to yourself and you'll feel more comfortable at night knowing you have the best bodyguard you can wish for sleeping just in the next room. He wiggled his eyebrows suggestively and she shook her head in disbelief, smiling a bit as she punched him playfully on the arm. I don't think so, Naruto, but I'm flattered for the invitation. He lifted his arms up in defeat. Hey, it was worth the try. He sighed and just stared for a while. Damn, now I'll have no one to split the rent with. They submerged themselves in petty small talk again, but the little monster called worry kept gnawing at the back of Naruto's mind. As we've already mentioned before, the Hokage Tower was one of the busiest places in Konoha. People came and went from it at all times of day, looking harried, joyous, or just plain exhausted from the completion of a recent mission when they did. The key moment in coming and going, though, was that you actually had to be inside the tower at some point in time. Something someone much expected was anything but. Where the hell is she? The blonde big-chested Hokage fumed, slamming her sake bottle angrily on her desk with so much force that the liquid it contained almost sloshed all out. Please, calm down, Tsunade-sama, it's really bad for your health too. Her fretful assistant's worried chatter was cut short by her raucous superior. No, Shizune, what's really bad for my health is for my people not to arrive on time when I have practically the whole route breathing down my neck. She grunted in displeasure and crossed her arms over her bosom. What a feat that must have been, with her forefinger tapping an angry staccato rhythm against her pale, much too smooth for a 60-year-old woman's skin. Honestly, is that really the girl Ibiki claims could someday surpass him? Why doesn't she start by surpassing him in punctuality, huh? Is that really so much to ask for around here? At the bemused look on Naruto's face, the blonde had peculiarly stayed completely quiet during Tsunade's outburst. Shizune leaned closer to him for a brief whispered explanation. She had an important meeting with Kakashi-san 2 hours ago. He is yet to show up. Naruto's cerulean orbs brightened with understanding at that little piece of information and he gave the brunette a slow nod in acknowledgement of her predicament. Before any more tantrums could be thrown, tempers flared and nerve cells irrevocably annihilated, the door to the office creaked open slightly, wide enough for a platinum blonde head to poke inside. As if caught red-handed in the middle of doing something illicit, once spotted by her fellow blonde superior, who looked very much like she was on a rampage from where the newcomer was standing, Ino cringed lightly and let herself in, closing the door behind herself. Naruto took the chance to check her over for injuries or trace of anything that he should worry about and was surprised to find none. Even her expression looked completely composed, save for the fact that guilt and embarrassment were emanating from her in thick waves. And it was exactly that impeccability of appearance that begot his suspicion at once. Who arrived more than an hour late for one of the most important missions to Konoha for the year after being explicitly told to be punctual and look like they hadn't had a good reason for being late. Except Kakashi. He didn't count. His trespass into the realm of chronic disease. I'm horribly sorry for the lateness of my arrival, Tsunade-sama. The young woman bowed deeply and hung her head low in shame when she stood upright again. I will take any punishment you deem worthy. I am deeply, deeply sorry. Needless to say, no valid reason for her insubordination figured along that sentence. The Hokage's hazel eyes narrowed to malicious slits and the room suddenly became heavy with killer intent. For the first time in history, Naruto actually wished he had been the one to stir the Sennin's volatile temper. After getting severely yelled at, admonished, threatened and intimidated in all ways known and not to humankind, Ino was sent along with her friend an hour and a half late for their hopelessly important mission. Said concerned friend had had his easily stirred anxiety for the welfare of his closest ones severely shaken awake by the kunoichi's out of characteristically late arrival and had thus taken it upon himself to observe her conduct all throughout their mission. If she hadn't revealed to him a few short months ago the most unexpected secret phobia of hers that she had never even shown the tiniest hint of having, he might have been convinced by her flawlessly normal performance during the execution of their job and perfectly safe return. He wouldn't be so easily swung this time though. So, grappling for a prolongation of his observation on her, he called on their tradition of having some tea or a quick meal after a job well done. Predictably, she gave him no need for concern and, although he was still a bit wary, he wrote it off as paranoia and dropped the tension, opting instead for an enjoyable meal with his dare he say, best friend. He was on his way to Tsunade Ba-chan's office to tell her he'd just moved in all of his things into his new abode and offer her an excuse to ditch work for an hour or two to give her the tour when he heard a couple of Ino's colleagues conversing in nervous tones. She's been late the past week a bit but today's got to be worst day off, she never even showed. One shook his head with care. That doesn't sound anything like Ino-senpai, agreed the other, arms crossing over his chest, his gaze equally as heavy with worry for his senior. He didn't even spare a second to doubt his decision, he went straight for her flat to check on her. Geez, did that girl have any idea how much she was making all her coworkers fret over her? Did she even have an inkling of how much she was making him worry over her lately? It had to stop, one way or another. There had to be a way to keep an eye on her, but as subtly and stealthily as he could manage. Spying and following her around had proved once, don't ask, not to be an option, so it was back to the drawing board with him. There had to be a way, he just didn't know how yet. He found her a few minutes later, not in her apartment or in the flower shop but on the flower field her family had owned, watching with a blissfully listless expression the gentle blossoms sway in the wind. There was something about the emptiness of her look, the lack of something uniquely Ino in it, that stuck him sharply in the heart like a hurtled kunai. Hey, he greeted softly as he crouched down next to her sitting form on the ground. If there was ever any certain sign that a shinobi was not in the fittest form of mind, it was when you managed to startle them with your appearance in a wide open plain where they would usually feel you coming from miles away. And there was no mistaking the sudden awareness and uncalled for wonderment in the azure orbs. Hi, Naruto. What brings you here? She talked in a cheery, casual voice as though it could any longer wheedle him into believing she was fine. As a stark contrast to the complete stillness of her body a moment ago when she'd only been scrutinizing the barely existent movement of the flower stalks, she became alive again as she began picking this one and that for a bouquet. I heard Yoshimoto and Morimasa saying you didn't show at headquarters today even though they expected you, and wondered why. He looked at her closely, as if that alone would be enough to pry information from her. Is anything the matter, Ino-chan? She looked up distractedly from collecting her bouquet to give him what she probably considered her reassuring glance, but he deemed it a failure because he didn't feel the tiniest bit reassured. Oh, everything's alright, Naruto, I just slept in and something about the day made me feel like leaving it up to the rest of the shinobi force to deal with missions and reports. I'm sure I sent a scroll that I'm calling in for the day, how odd that they didn't get it. Her offhand behavior had no effect on him either. And the severe shadows under her eyes that she seemed to have gone out of her way to conceal with makeup before going outside did nothing to soothe his worry either. As a matter of fact, they only served to deepen his worry. She was lying about one thing for sure, so what proof did he have that she wasn't lying about the rest as well? Ino, he began with a gravely serious voice, reaching out to stop the movement of her hand that plucked flowers so he would have her undivided attention. If there's anything troubling you, you know you can always tell me. Yes, I know, she replied, in an equally slow and forced into seriousness out of courtesy tone. She didn't seem to understand the expectant look he was giving her. And, he urged tentatively, and what? Is there anything troubling you? I already told you. Naruto, I'm fine. She continued picking flowers with a small smile on her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. You worry too much. Looking at her there, all alone and with an air of immutable gloom hanging over her, it was immensely hard to believe her words. But then again, what more could a friend do than just worry? He wanted to take action to fix whatever was waiting on his buddy's mind, but how could he if she wouldn't let him? Ino wasn't one of the people who liked being forced into confessing things or having goodwill imposed on them without their specific asking for it. What could he do other than stand around, hoping against hope that she'd be able to overcome whatever demons she was battling in her mind and resurface over the darkness that was seizing her in a firmer and firmer grip with each passing day, before his very eyes? How could he chuck her a candle to light her way in it if she didn't want to? And it hit him. At that exact same moment, he had an epiphany of highest instance. It was so brilliant, so foolproof, so freaking genius that it bordered on divine intervention. The answer to his question was so easy and in the same time simply superb. He didn't know it at that point in time, but he said the 8 little words that would alter the course of his life forever. Would you like to move in with me? His ingenious proposition was greeted by deafening silence and lots of blinking.